In April of 1917, when the United States declared war on Germany, the nation was swept up in a wave of patriotic fervor. The rallying cry was to darken the skies over Europe with a massive armada of American-built aircraft, flown by brave American pilots. The press and the public envisioned a swift, decisive victory led by a new generation of knights of the air. It was a glorious vision. It was also a complete fantasy. The truth was, in 1917, the United States was a third-rate air power. It had no modern combat aircraft, no system for mass-producing them, and most critically, no way to train the thousands of pilots it would need. The desperate, chaotic race to build an air force from scratch would become one of the most troubled and tragic chapters of the American home front. To fill the skies, they needed training planes, and they needed them immediately. In their haste, they approved a design that was rushed, flawed, and powered by an engine so notoriously unreliable that it would soon earn a grim nickname from the young cadets who were forced to fly it. They called it the Flying Coffin. This is the hidden story of the deathtrap that killed America's first pilots. It's a tale not of glorious dogfights over France, but of tragic, preventable accidents in the skies over Texas and Illinois. It's the story of a fatal design flaw, a national scandal, and the heartbreaking reality that for many of America's first aviators, the most dangerous enemy they faced was not a German ace, but the very plane they were taught to fly. When war was declared, the state of American military aviation was abysmal. The aviation section of the U.S. Army Signal Corps consisted of just over 1,000 men and possessed a handful of obsolete, unarmed observation planes. They had zero combat experience. In contrast, the nations of Europe had been engaged in a brutal air war for 3 years, developing sophisticated fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. America was starting from scratch. The first and most urgent need was for a primary training aircraft. Thousands of young volunteers were flocking to join the air service, but there was nothing for them to fly. The government needed a simple, stable, two-seat biplane that could be mass-produced quickly and cheaply. Two main designs were considered. The first was the Curtiss JN-4, nicknamed the Jenny. It was a well-regarded and relatively safe aircraft, but the Curtiss company was already overwhelmed with orders. The second option was a plane built by the Standard Aircraft Corporation of New Jersey, the Standard J-1. On paper, it looked perfect. It was a conventional biplane, similar in design to the Jenny, and the company promised it could be produced in massive numbers. The government, desperate for planes, placed a huge order for over 1,600 Standard J-1s. The problem lay not with the airframe itself, but with its engine. In the rush to power this new fleet of trainers, the government had a surplus of an engine called the Hallscott A7A. This was a 4-cylinder, water-cooled engine that was supposed to produce 100 horsepower. It was chosen not because it was the best engine, but because it was available. This decision would prove to be fatal. From the moment the first Standard J-1s arrived at the new, hastily constructed training fields across the country in late 1917, the problems began. The Hallscott engine was a mechanical nightmare. Its fundamental flaw was a catastrophic level of vibration. The engine shook so violently that it would literally tear the aircraft apart in the sky. The vibrations would travel down the wooden fuselage, causing structural components to crack and fail. Motor mounts would shear off. Fuel lines would rupture. Control wires would snap. Young cadets, on their very first solo flights, would suddenly find their controls going limp or their engine rattling itself loose from the frame. But the most terrifying flaw was the engine's tendency to backfire, sending a shower of sparks into the engine compartment, which was often soaked with leaking fuel and oil. The risk of in-flight fire was constant and terrifying. The young men sent to train on these planes were the best and brightest of their generation. They were often Ivy League students, athletes, and adventurers, drawn to the romance and glory of becoming a pilot. They arrived at sprawling, muddy training fields like Kelly Field in Texas or Chanute Field in Illinois, eager to learn. Their training was broken into stages. First came ground school, a chaotic crash course in aerodynamics, engine mechanics, and Morse code. Then came the first flights, sitting in the front seat of a J-1 with an instructor in the back, learning the basic feel of the controls. It was during this phase that the plane's deadly reputation was born. Instructors and students alike began to experience the terrifying unreliability of the Hall-Scott engine. An instructor at Ellington Field wrote a scathing report. "The Hall-Scott motor is a menace. It is chronically prone to overheating. The valve springs break with alarming regularity, and the vibration is so severe that I have seen the entire engine cowling shake loose in midair. I have had 3 engine failures in the last week alone. We are killing more of our own men than the Germans." The stories from the training fields became the stuff of dark legend. Cadets spoke in hushed tones about friends who had taken off for a routine flight and never returned. They saw the black smoke on the horizon that meant another J-1 had gone down. They saw the meat wagon, the ambulance, racing across the field. They began calling the plane the flying coffin. The psychological toll was immense. Every time a cadet strapped himself into the cockpit of a standard J-1, he knew he was not just learning to fly. He was rolling the dice with a faulty machine. He had to worry not only about his own mistakes as a novice pilot, but also about the constant possibility that his plane would simply disintegrate around him. The accident rate was staggering. In just a few months of training in early 1918, hundreds of fatal crashes were attributed to the failure of the J-1 and its Hall-Scott engine. The exact numbers are difficult to ascertain, but it is widely accepted that during this period, more American pilots died in training accidents in the United States than were killed in combat over France. It was a national scandal brewing just beneath the surface of the patriotic war effort. The press began to pick up on the stories. Grieving families began demanding answers. Why were their sons dying in Texas before they even had a chance to face the enemy? The situation became so dire that the famous aviator and war hero Captain Eddie Rickenbacker was called in to investigate. He was horrified by what he found. After test flying a standard J-1 himself, he reportedly said, "I would not send my pet dog up in one of them." He condemned the plane and its engine in the strongest possible terms. Another investigation, led by a former Supreme Court justice, was launched to look into the entire aircraft production program, which was plagued by corruption and incompetence. The evidence against the Hall-Scott engine was overwhelming. It was not just the vibration and the fires. The engine's ignition system was unreliable, its cooling system was inadequate, and its parts were poorly manufactured. It was a fundamentally flawed piece of engineering that had been rushed into service out of desperation. By the summer of 1918, the government could no longer ignore the problem. The public outcry and the sheer number of dead cadets forced their hand. In a massive and costly decision, the Army officially condemned the Hall-Scott A-7A engine. All standard J-1 training planes were grounded permanently. The flying coffins were pushed to the edge of the airfields and left to rot. The Army was now faced with an even bigger crisis. They had thousands of pilots to train and had just grounded their primary training aircraft. The solution was another mad scramble. They rushed to replace the Hall-Scott engines in the J-1s with more reliable Curtiss OX-5 engines, the same engine used in the Jenny. This conversion process was slow and expensive, but it was necessary. The modified planes, designated J-1S, were much safer, but the damage to the training program's timeline and morale had been done. The story of the standard J-1 is a powerful and tragic hidden front of the First World War. It's a tale that gets lost between the epic stories of trench warfare and aerial dogfights. But for the hundreds of young men who lost their lives in these flawed machines, the war was just as real and just as deadly. Their enemy was not a German pilot in a Fokker triplane. It was a poorly designed engine, a faulty fuel line, and a bureaucracy that had prioritized speed over safety. They were casualties of America's desperate and chaotic rush to build an air force from nothing. The saga of the flying coffin serves as a brutal reminder that the path to military readiness is often paved with mistakes, and that the first casualties of any war are often not on the battlefield, but on the training ground. The brave young men who strapped themselves into the cockpits of the standard J-1 were America's first aviators. They dreamed of flying and fighting for their country. Tragically, for too many of them, their greatest battle was not against the enemy, but against the very machine that was supposed to give them wings. They were the forgotten first victims of America's air war, killed not by enemy action, but by a fatal design flaw.